More people are being forcibly displaced as the annual Refugee Day is marked internationally. What's behind the apparent increase in the number of refugees? And how should the world act to address their plight? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Last year saw the highest number of displaced people worldwide in decades. That's according to the Global Trends report released by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. The release coincides with what is being called a humanitarian catastrophe in Central Asia. An outbreak of violence in southern Kyrgyzstan has left many dead and wounded, and tens of thousands of people are about to become part of the statistics in the next UNHCR report. The conflict that began on Thursday has forced many to flee to neighboring Uzbekistan. More than 100,000 people are expected to be displaced. Uzbek officials say they've already registered over 45,000 refugees and cannot accommodate any more. They sealed the borders on Monday, despite pleas from aid groups and the UN. The ongoing crisis in Central Asia just highlights the issue of refugees. Let's look at the numbers for 2009, according to the UNHCR. At the end of last year, 43.3 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced. The UNHCR assisted over 26 million people. That's a million more than in 2008. Some 6.6 million people in 60 countries were identified as stateless. And 4/5 of the world's refugees were hosted in developing countries. It was also a year of contrasts. Over 250,000 refugees abroad returned to their home countries, at the lowest figure since 1990. And while more than 2.2 million internally displaced people were able to return, the highest in at least a decade. As to the question of getting refugees home, as opposed to internally displaced people, UNHCR Chief Antonio Guterres had called 2009 the worst year for the voluntary repatriation of people in 2 decades. Major conflicts such as those in Afghanistan, Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo show no signs of being resolved, he says. Conflicts that appear to be ending or were on their way to being resolved, such as in southern Sudan or in Iraq, are stagnating. As a result, last year was not a good year for voluntary repatriation. In fact, it was the worst in 20 years. Well, joining our discussion today are our guests. In Geneva, Adrian Edwards, the UN's Refugee Agency Chief Spokesperson. In Berlin, Beate van Wyk, Secretary General of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. And in London, Richard Whittle from the Coalition to Stop Deportations to Iraq. Let's begin in Geneva and Adrian Edwards. Over 40 million people forcibly displaced in this past year. Is there any specific cause for this increase?
Well, I think before we get to the causes, let's look at how these figures come together. And I think this is important for your audience to understand. With 43.3 million people forcibly displaced in the world, that's the highest number since the mid-90s. We've also got that combining with the fact that voluntary repatriation is at a low. We had 251,000 people voluntary return to their own countries last year. That's the lowest number we've seen in nearly 20 years. Put those two things together and you start to see the picture. You've got an awful lot of people, millions of people around the world in a protracted, displaced situation, a lot of people suffering as a result of how things are.
So we're looking at a mixture between an increase in numbers of actual refugees and a delay in getting refugees back home. Is that correct, Adrian?
That's absolutely correct. What we're seeing around the world is, if you like, a trend towards people being refugees, living as refugees for many years. In fact, I think about half or more of the people we have under our care as refugees are living in what we call this protracted refugee situation. That means 5 years or more as they are, without countries offering up opportunity to resettle at a faster rate, and without people returning home at a faster rate. That means that people either have to stick where they are or be integrated locally. And that really, that's how it comes together, and that's where the nub of the problem is.
Beate van Wyk in Berlin, looking at the list of countries which the UN released, of those countries from which refugees have come, those countries to which they are gone. It is a very long list indeed. In fact, virtually every country on the planet is in some way affected by the crisis of refugees and internally displaced people.
Yes, and I think we, as Europeans as well, have to be aware of the enormous consequences and dimensions of displacement. You mentioned some of the countries where people are fleeing from are obvious countries in very, very deep levels of crisis with generalized violence, where we can refer to Afghanistan, to Somalia, to Russia, and to Iraq, topping the list of people sort of fleeing. And I think it's obvious why these countries are creating refugees with the problems they have, both when it comes to the security level or the lack of security for people, and what that generates also of harshness for people when it comes to trying to cope. And we see also that more and more people flee for mixed reasons, because there's draft on top of it, because they can't make a living.
Well, Richard Whittle in London, the one clear thing that emerges is a clear correlation between violence and refugees.
Well, quite. And Iraq, for example, continues to suffer from the consequences of war. Iraqi refugees leaving that often go to countries like, for example, the UK. When they get to the UK, they're then faced with anti-immigrant, hysteria is a fair word for it, encouraged by governments and the right-wing media, which is then leading to people being forcibly deported from the UK. For example, last week there was a flight from the UK and Sweden to Baghdad with 50 people on. There's another one scheduled for tomorrow back to Iraq, which continues to suffer from the insecurity and violence caused by the war.
Well, we'll return to that point in a moment, but let's just take a look at which countries people are fleeing from and who is giving them shelter. 3 decades of conflict makes Afghanistan the leading country, with well over 2 million refugees who fled. Following years of political dictatorship and conflict, 1.7 million refugees have left Iraq. More than 600,000 people have fled Somalia, and 450,000 have left the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. So where do all these refugees go? Over 1 million Afghan refugees crossed the border to Pakistan, making it the leading host nation. Iran follows closely behind with a similar figure. Syria houses over 1 million refugees, and Germany has over 500,000. Now, to mention as well in the report, we just took some examples there of figures, but Adrian Edwards in Geneva, one mention as well in the report, Colombia, over 3 million internally displaced people. Now, this is an interesting figure, given that it is from an area not necessarily associated all the time in the media, at least, with an ongoing internal displacement or refugee problem.
That's absolutely right. Colombia doesn't really get much attention. It certainly has a very large, if you like, what we call an internal refugee problem. It's certainly not the only country that has so. If you look at Sudan, for example, if you look at Pakistan as well, you see countries where you do have large numbers of internally displaced people. This is part of the phenomenon. Remember that there's a distinction here. We see refugees as people who've crossed international borders, but the vast majority of people are displaced within their own countries. Colombia is one example of that.
Well, let's take that to Beate van Wyk in Berlin. The difference, I think, must be made very clear between refugees and internally displaced people. Once that is made clear as well, is the vision of dealing with the problem the same, or obviously it would change, would it not?
It would change in the way that as soon as you have crossed a border, an international border, then you have some sort of standards of protection according to the mandate of UNHCR and according to the so-called Geneva Convention of 1954. 51. So then if you're recognized as a refugee under that international rule, then you should be treated accordingly. You shouldn't be sent back to your country of origin. You shouldn't be ill-treated. You should be given rights to work and to integrate to a certain extent. Whereas if you're inside a country and you're displaced there, it's much more difficult, of course, for the international society, for organizations to claim any rights because you're still under the jurisdiction of your own country. So
that's a very important difference, but touched on a little bit earlier was the question of people being returned to their countries who do not want to return. Richard Whittle in London, this is something that makes the whole position even more complex, is it not?
Well, it is. It is. And a further complication of this is, I mean, for example, at the moment, 13 people who were deported on the flight I mentioned last week from the UK and Sweden to Baghdad are currently still in detention in Baghdad airport because the authorities there say they do not have the right ID. They do not have proof they're Iraqis, which begs a question. I mean, well, it begs yet another question why they were sent back there in the first place.
Oh, Beate van Wyk, many of those Iraqi refugees from Europe, does this point to the necessity for some kind of regional agreement, some kind of standards that can be observed by the host countries in terms of when refugees should be returned and why?
Well, I think it's a very important point you're raising, and the colleague in London as well, because with the Iraqi situation, which was the biggest refugee crisis in the Middle East since the Second World War, we saw that a lot of European governments were actually shying away from their responsibility. On one hand, some of the same states that were so eager to create peace, democracy and human rights in Iraq that they sent soldiers there, when people were fleeing because there was no peace and human rights, were then turning their backs to them and say, well, go somewhere else. I think there is a very unfortunate and very politically hostile environment in many European states today when it comes to refugees in particular. And I think we as Europeans must really take a good look at ourselves when it comes to contributing as a very privileged part of the world to finding solutions for the world's refugees. We can't just build a wall around our part of the world and then pretend that these problems will disappear, because they won't. And we need to play a more active role, both in helping countries in the region, such as in this example, Iraq and Jordan, and also show by example that it's important to uphold the international standards, to respect human rights, and that means the same things that the European Union is built on, to avoid persecution and give shelter for people that are being persecuted. That is under threat in Europe today, I'm afraid.
Adrian Edwards in Geneva, would you like to pick up on some of those comments made there, that there should be greater responsibility assumed by international countries?
Well, I'd certainly agree with much of what was just said here. There is a populist myth in many industrialized countries that those countries are awash with people, with refugees and asylum seekers. That's not the case. If you look at the numbers, and these are very clear on this point, 4/5 of the world's displaced people are 4/5 of the world's refugees are in developing countries. Most of those are in developing world cities. So there's a lot of populist rhetoric attached to this notion, which I do think needs to be tackled.
Well, let's just take a look at what can be done. According to experts, many refugees remain with no legal rights, open to exploitation and discrimination. So what is being done for them? The UNHCR has described what it calls durable solutions. Voluntary repatriation is the first suggestion, working with both the host and countries of origin to help refugees return home. For those unable to return home, the next step would be to explore resettlement in an alternative country. When neither of these are possible, the UNHCR says the refugees should be integrated into the local communities of their host country. Now, this brings us to the point that we have just been discussing. And Richard Whittle in London, this issue of responsibility of host countries, the intention to include, assimilate some refugees into communities, this seems very absent in terms of what countries are actually doing.
Well, at the government level, yeah. I mean, at the community level, I think there are a lot of fantastic examples throughout the UK of people coming from places like Iraq, for example, becoming very settled in the community, living their life here, making families here, friends in the community, and working here. But yeah, there is an agenda from the government, and it's backed by an increasingly kind of viscerally racist press that says immigrants are to blame for all the problems in society. So welfare, unemployment, the housing shortage. The blame is cast onto people who have come into the country, often refugees. I think this needs to be tackled by people who believe people should have the right to stay in the UK and across Europe, by people who believe in freedom of movement as a right. These things need to be challenged, and the actions of refugees and migrants themselves needs to be supported. I mean, for example, we were talking about deportations to Iraq. Deportations to the northern region of Iraq, the Kurdistan region, have been happening for the last 5 years from the UK. In the last 3 or 4 months, because of action in Kurdistan by people who have been deported, so big demonstrations, pickets, media campaign, they've actually shamed the Kurdistan regional government into stopping accepting forcible deportations from the UK. So there hasn't been one for 4 months. I mean, this is a fantastic achievement, and we need to stand with that and support struggles like that.
Pieter van Wyk, we heard the point being made a little bit earlier about the fact that refugees, the greatest problem is in the developing countries, not in the developed ones. 4/5 of refugees in those countries. And yet is a reason for this that there is a greater reluctance in developed countries, such as in Europe, to accept refugees than there are in those neighbours of countries in which the crisis exists?
Well, the very simple, straightforward answer to that is yes. I was in Kenya just over a month ago and up by the border to Somalia, and you would see people crossing that border all the time because they are desperate to find protection. There are 400,000 Somalis probably living as refugees in one country in Africa alone, whereas the European countries are extremely reluctant. We had some 200 and something thousand asylum seekers to Europe last year, but still it's portrayed as there's masses of people flooding Europe, and this is not true at all. There was a slight upsurge a couple of years ago with the Iraqi crisis, but apart from that, there's never been fewer people coming to Europe in 20 years. So we are not in Europe taking our fair share, and we are not doing enough in the regions to support people, or as possibly also taking the most vulnerable cases out of these enormous camps that has existed, as a colleague in UNHCR said, for 15, 20 years. We should then say we will take some of the refugees out of there to find durable solutions, real solutions where they get protection and where they get a future, because we do have the ability still here in Europe. And it's about changing that rhetoric from the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee into a question of respecting the international treaties we're parts of, and into being solidaric when it comes to sharing the responsibility, as we say, or burdens, as governments often say, because that's the only way forward, unless we create peace everywhere. And even though all of us wants that, it's not going to be achieved immediately. So then we need to deal decently with the victims of these conflicts.
Well, we have there the phrase asylum seekers, yet another category, and these figures are very instructive in terms of this discussion, that the UNHCR figures show that 222,000 asylum seekers are in South Africa, 47 in the US, 42,000 in France, and 40,000 in Malaysia. Now, looking at these figures, Adrian Edwards, it does appear once again it is the developing nation, that is South Africa, which is taking the bulk of asylum seekers, as opposed to a developed nation such as the US, which is taking some 47,000, as opposed to close to 250,000.
Well, that's right. Certainly South Africa takes a very large number of people. In fact, I think if you look at the numbers for Europe overall, you'll see there are not many more being applying for asylum there than in South Africa. So South Africa really is a leading country in this regard. I think one thing needs to be touched on, which is you have to look at what refugees themselves want. And we have seen time and time again that what most people want, in fact, is to return home. Where they can, people will go back to their countries of origin. That is the desired outcome. Unfortunately, and as we've heard in this discussion, because of ongoing conflict in a number of places, that simply isn't possible at the moment. So we do have this situation, if I come back to what I said at the beginning, where you've got many people stuck in this protracted situation.
Pieter van Wyk, that issue about what refugees want in the end is to return home. The refugee bodies, those assisting internally displaced, are in the end dealing with consequence, not cause. How important is it, do you think, that hand in hand with consequence is a focus on cause as well?
Well, of course, it is important to focus on cause, and I think it's right that refugees don't want to be in the situation they're in. I mean, the very origins of their existence is that they're forcibly displaced. They're not economic migrants. They're not people who choose to live abroad. They just have no other choice. So avoiding the causes is, of course, the best remedy to any of it. But as we see, there are a number of conflict areas in the world today where we are not likely, even with all sorts of interventions and pressure, where we're not likely to find solutions. And this will be part of the picture for the foreseeable future. And therefore, we need to plan and act accordingly as well. But I think that a lot more could be done with negotiations, with trying to also stabilize the countries that are the most problematic and creates the most refugees. And we have seen some interventions to that effect, for instance, in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, that created enormous amounts of refugees, and the atrocities that went on were terrible. But that's not possible everywhere. So we also need to take into account that we need to have a contingency, we need to have open doors, and we need to have a level of solidarity also for the future to welcome refugees in our part of the world, in Europe.
Well, Adrian Edwards in Geneva, briefly, I see you nodding. Your comment on that, anything to add?
No, I think I would agree with that. In the absence of durable solutions of return, and let's remember that with UNHCR, we only support voluntary return to a country. In the absence of that possibility, we have to look what can be done to help solutions elsewhere. That means resettlement. We need more countries to be resettling, accepting refugees for resettlement, and we need to look at the needs of countries which are hosting large refugee populations. I think those really have to be where the focus is.
Well, my thanks to our guests, Adrian Edwards in Geneva, Pieter van Wyk in Berlin, and Richard Whittle in London. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.